Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harenkiu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is March the 16th. It is Wednesday, and today I am joined by University of Alabama professor and historian Dr. Margaret Peacock. Now, Professor Peacock is here today to talk a little bit about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what is going on over there, what we are really looking at, and kind of break down some of the things that we need to take away from this situation. Now, Professor Peacock is an expert in the history of the Soviet Union, specifically in Cold War Russian history, and also about countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. I know you've got a lot of specialties here, Professor. It's kind of hard to break them down into just a quick intro, but that Russian history, Soviet Union history is kind of your wheelhouse. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's what I've been working on now for the better part of 20 years at the graduate and professor level. Yeah.
And again, Professor Peacock does teach at the University of Alabama. So, let's just get into it, Professor. There is a lot happening here. Again, we've been watching for 3 weeks as Russia has invaded Ukraine, going into the 4th week. We saw this morning that President Zelensky of Ukraine delivered an address to the U.S. Congress this morning virtually. I think a lot of us probably watched that. So let me just get, first of all, your take on this situation that is happening in Ukraine and also on the address this morning.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, although it's not under the best of circumstances. I wish we could be talking about something happier. The sad part of this story is that while Zelensky's speech before Congress was well received and emotionally heart-wrenching and really important as an articulation of Ukrainian identity and solidarity and resolve, we are still nonetheless in a situation where what Biden said a week ago still holds, or less than a week ago at this point, right? Which is that the United States is not going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. There is no design in place for the United States to get militarily involved, or for NATO, for that matter, to get militarily involved in the defense of Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting a great fight and working really, really hard. And what they are doing and what Zelensky is doing is profoundly admirable. What the Russians are doing is venal and unforgivable and unacceptable. Nonetheless, no one wants World War III. No one wants this conflict to escalate further. And what that means ultimately is that Ukraine is on its own. Yeah.
This morning, after the address that President Zelensky delivered to Congress, there was bipartisan support there. We saw a standing ovation from what looked like everybody in that chamber, at least most everybody in that chamber, applauding President Zelensky after that speech. I even saw, and I don't have it in front of me, but I actually saw after the speech that Alabama Senator Richard Shelby tweeted support, saying that we needed to do everything that we could for Ukraine now. We have seen support from our governor, Kay Ivey, saying that she actually wanted the last thing Putin to see was to be a Javelin missile that was made in Alabama. We also have seen even support from our other senator from Alabama, Senator Tommy Tuberville. There seems to be bipartisan support for Ukraine right now. Do you think that is important, that we stand united as a country for Ukraine and against what Russia is doing?
I mean, there's a lot of really good signaling of American support, both at the national and local level, for the Ukrainian plight. And it's clearly playing really well domestically for U.S. politicians to, whether we're talking about Alabama or Georgia or Montana, for U.S. politicians to express that bipartisan solidarity. I mean, what else would you do, right? The Russian problem, right? Russia since 2016 and since the impeachment trial, right? Russia has itself become a domestic political rallying point, right? And on various sides of the partisan issues here in the United States at home. So it makes a lot of sense that all that, the standing ovations would happen and that we would muster lots and lots of angry rhetoric towards the Russians, right, as a way to signal our own identity as as Americans, as Alabamians who support the Ukrainian plight. But the sad part of it is that it is just language. Like, the sad part of this story is that it is just a standing ovation. And the whole sending of Javelin missiles to Ukraine isn't new, right? We've been selling weapons to Ukraine for a really long time. It's not a game changer that we're selling Javelin missiles. That's been going on for quite a while. There's the standing ovations and there's all the language that's coming out of the politicians. But if you listen to the generals, if you listen to the people who are, in the State Department, the people who are actually making decisions on the ground about American foreign policy in Ukraine right now, the decision is that we are going to happily sell guns. All right, we're going to happily send material support. We're going to happily, I think, welcome Ukrainian refugees if they can get here, right? We're going to happily open our doors to them. But that's all that we're going to do. There is a profound limit to what the United States and the rest of Western Europe, the rest of NATO, right, is going to be willing to offer.
Well, do you think that President Zelensky's speech this morning, or do you think just in general, the support for helping Ukraine that a lot of America is experiencing right now and really sending along to their elected officials to President Biden's office, is that going to make a difference, or is that decision already made?
I think these policies are already made, right? Right now, the standing ovations have just as much to do with domestic politics as they do with international affairs here in the United States. Not to sound cynical, but it just is a reality, right? What would it look like if you didn't stand up and clap after Zelensky's speech, right? So there is the language of grand support, and then there is the reality of very limited support.
We were talking before we went live, Professor, and I was asking you why Alabamians should care about this. There are plenty of people who prefer to stick their head in the sand, to not pay attention, to not turn on national news, and to not get on national news websites. They just don't want to know what's happening across the country, or across the world, excuse me, because they say, well, we're here in Alabama. That's not going to affect me. Russia's not my neighbor. Ukraine's not my neighbor. So what's your message to those people?
Well, I mean, maybe that's true. Like, maybe if you want to just continue on with your life, the odds are that the sufferings of the Ukrainian people are probably not going to have an immediate and direct impact on the way you live your life, right? You're still going to get up and go to work and manage your children and live your life the way you always do. There's the price of gasoline that's spiking, but in truth, right, the price of gasoline spiking really, in practical terms, in material terms, doesn't actually have all that much to do with Moscow or with Russian policy or with their invasion of Ukraine. We know that the actual cost of barrels of gas right now are not actually that high. The reason gasoline is so expensive is because the gasoline companies are using this event as an excuse to inflate prices, right? As an excuse to bilk every penny out of the American public, right? That's what's really going on. So there's that. The reason why, if you do want to care, right, is because Ukraine is filled with human beings, and we need to care about what happens to other people. We need to care about what happens to other people around the world. Now, if that is true, let me just give this caveat, that if it is true that the reason we should care about Ukraine is because those are human beings living lives and that they're just like us and that they just want to go to work and love their kids and get married and have good lives and go to jobs that they enjoy, if it is in fact that we just need to care because they're fellow humans, then we also need to be really careful about the way we check which humans we decide to care about and which humans we choose not to care about. So it's really not, it's easy and convenient to give standing ovations to Zelensky, but there's been an orchestrated regime change with lots and lots of violence happening in Yemen for the last 3 months, and no one is doing standing ovations for Yemeni freedom fighters right now. There are populations in the United States who are suffering from tremendous poverty, right? Tremendous want. And we don't see ourselves rallying behind them, right, to give them great, generous national support. So we need to be really careful that we really check our willingness to care about all human beings, not just Europeans who happen to be white-skinned.
Professor, you spent a large portion of your career studying Cold War Russian history, studying the history of the Soviet Union, propaganda used in the Cold War and in the Soviet Union in Russia for years. So you have probably, I think it's fair to say, you've spent a lot more time and a lot more years combined looking at this part of the world and looking at the politics of this part of the world, their culture, than most of us have. Most of us are tuning in now because this is the hot topic. You've been tuning in for a long time. So that being said, you have experienced the culture in Russia and in Ukraine and in these countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union there. So is this surprising to you? Is this something that you were surprised to see when Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th? Are you surprised that we're here today? Or did you think that this was just something that maybe was a Cold War situation or that it just wouldn't get this far?
So, I mean, I think everyone was a little bit surprised that it happened when it happened. There was always, before it happened, I was interviewed by a few, news outlets about whether or not it was going to happen. And my answer was, well, I don't know, and I think so on some level, one is always surprised, unless you're privy to the backroom, plans that are going on in the Kremlin. No one really could see it necessarily coming, at least people even like me, right? It wasn't obvious that it was coming, or at least that it was coming on specifically that day. There were lots of signs of it, however. And so even in those early days before it happened and I was being interviewed, my answer would always be, we don't know exactly when, and it's still possible that it won't happen, but the odds look good that it will, was sort of my standard answer. And the reason the odds looked good that it would happen is because of a number of factors. The first one being the continuous, steady Ukrainian bid to join NATO was seen as really problematic by the Kremlin. You have to remember that NATO, the organization NATO, came into existence as a product of the Cold War, right? NATO was created originally in order to counter Soviet power, in order to stop the spread of communism around the world, right? That's why NATO came into existence. And after NATO came into existence, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, right, as a counter to that. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the Communist Party in the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia was no longer a communist country, right? Russia stopped being a communist country. And so the existence of NATO became really problematic. NATO was created in order to counter the spread of communism, Soviet communism around the world. And yet after the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO continued to exist. And Russia, now it's just called the Russian Federation, continued to see NATO as a really dangerous organization that, that represented, a potential threat to Russian sovereignty. And that's why Russia, continued to maintain, tacit de facto control over Ukraine and over Belarus, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, although Ukraine obviously has enjoyed varying levels of sovereignty and independence and freedom from Russia since then. But NATO itself is seen as a really problematic organization by Russia. So when Ukraine continued to push for its bid into entrance into NATO, that was a cue, right, that the Russians were going to seriously start to consider a regime change, orchestrating a regime change in Ukraine. You have to sort of keep in mind that, NATO, Ukraine joining NATO would be like Mexico joining the Warsaw Pact, right? NATO forces going into Ukraine would be like Russian forces going into Mexico, to sort of give that some perspective for what that means, right, for Russians. So they have this, Russia historically has this, what we call historical geographic insecurity. If you think about it, Russia's been invaded over and over and over and over again, because it doesn't have a lot of obvious natural geographic boundaries that give it natural protection, like the United States does with the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, like Britain has, right, with the English Channel, like Spain has with the Pyrenees, the Pyrenees Mountains, right? Russia doesn't have any of that. And if you think about it, over the last, 1,000 years, every invasion except for the Mongol invasion has come from the west, and it's come through the Great Plains that cross over Poland and over Ukraine. So Russia has a long-standing historical need to create and maintain friendly buffer states on its western borders in order to counter what it perceives as sort of a perpetual threat of Western invasion. Now, on top of that, we knew that there was lots of saber rattling over natural gas and petroleum pipelines heading from the Caspian Sea through Russia, through Ukraine into Western Europe. And of course, that pipeline represents a significant amount of the natural resources, the petroleum and natural gas that Western Europe consumes. If Ukraine isn't a friendly state to Russia, then Ukraine can do a lot to stop those pipelines, right? To inhibit the movement of oil and natural gas through those pipelines. And that's another major problem, right? That's another major catalyst. I think the other big trigger for Russia was that they perceived, I think incorrectly, but they perceived that in the wake of the pandemic, the United States and the Western allies were not going to be able to come together effectively to counter a Russian insurgency, that it was going to end up looking a lot like it did in 2014 with their overthrow, with their taking over of Crimea. And that hasn't worked out. That hasn't happened, right? We have seen real movement towards sanctions. One of the things I think you haven't asked me this, but I think one of the things that actually could end up really hurting Russia, Russia's got ample access to arms. It's us sanctioning Russia, I don't think is going to have any significant, at least not in the short term, any significant economic impact, because Russia can still continue to trade with the East. The one thing that is going to have an impact is if Europe is able to follow through on its plan to largely divest of its use of Russian oil and natural gas. The Russian economy is really a one-trick pony. The Russian economy is largely based on natural gas and petroleum exports. And if Europe can actually divest itself of those exports, then that is going to have a huge economic impact on Russia. And that could, in fact, actually make a difference.
That's an interesting point there, interesting take. Something I want to ask you kind of in that same vein of what we just talked about, saying that you have been immersed in this world for decades, while many of us are just entering this world. You are, like we said, you're more in tune with what's happening there. And you've been watching this media coverage. And I know you've done a lot of media interviews as well, just being so educated on this topic. And you told me that you don't think the media is asking the right questions. What do you think that we should be asking? What do you think that people should be talking about that's maybe not making that national media narrative right now?
I mean, I think I've kind of hinted at it now. I care profoundly for the Ukrainian people and for what they're going through. But, I think we need to keep in mind, we need to just sort of step back one level and acknowledge that there is a reason why we are paying such frantic attention right now to Ukraine. 65,000 people died of COVID in January. And it's looking like we're heading into another wave of that. We went through a horrendous pandemic in 2020 and 2021. That in many ways exposed so many of the deep underlying crises, the deep underlying structural crises that this nation still has, right? A broken healthcare system, real serious systemic problems with police violence and, racism in this country is alive and well. And we saw it. We saw it with George Floyd. We saw it with Breonna Taylor. We saw it with Ahmaud Arbery, and we saw it in 2021, right? When more police shootings happened in 2021 than they did in 2020, and we didn't fix any of it. Like none of it has been fixed, here domestically. And instead, what we've seen happen over the last month is a situation where Ukraine, it's a terrible thing that's happening in Ukraine, but let's be honest, the United States is not going to get involved militarily. This Ukrainian crisis is providing us a profoundly convenient distraction from what is really broken at home. Like we are broken in some really critical ways here domestically, and we don't want to think about it, right? We don't want to think about those structural problems. We don't want to think about all the people that died needlessly. We don't want to think about the fact that millions of Americans put their own personal individual needs over the needs of the nation over and over and over again, or about the fact that militia occupied state buildings because they didn't want to put on a mask in May of 2020. That there are some critical issues here at home that we have to tackle. And we got to remember this stuff. We can't just conveniently find a new media sensation event to forget about, to allow us to sort of move on to the next outrage without really addressing in any kind of constructive way the crises that are happening here at home.
Well, I think the counter argument there could be both. Number one, can we care about both? And number two, of an argument to that would be to say, well, you're right. There are domestic issues here at home that we cannot deny. At the same time, domestically, we are not facing a leader domestically or a opposition leader who has access to nuclear weapons. We are not waking up wondering, oh gosh, are we going to start a world war and have our neighbor fire nukes over the border? So I think that is, we could talk about that as well and just say, look, yes, we've got problems here. We don't have nuclear problems here.
Well, we have a nuclear problem. I mean, if Russia has a nuclear problem, then we have a nuclear problem. I mean, let's be super clear, right? Any use of nukes on either side will spell catastrophe, which is why I don't think that we're actually going to have a nuclear problem. I don't think that we're heading in that direction. I think that there are cooler heads prevailing. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis that we are living through right now. We are not playing chicken with nukes in the Gulf of Mexico right now. Like that's not what's happening, or on the Atlantic Ocean. Like that's not what's occurring right now. You're right. We should have both, right? I agree. Like it makes absolute sense that we should care about both. Sadly, that's not what's happening, right? Instead, it's 99.9% of the news is about this one thing that's happening on the other side of the planet, while there is, you can look on social media and it seems as though the coverage of the pandemic has basically disappeared. And certainly there's nobody doing hard investigative journalism right now that's looking at these deeper problems that were exposed by the pandemic and how we need to sort of move forward to fix it. If anything, what we've seen in the last 2 years is a concerted, steady effort to legislate out of remembering what actually happened in 2020, right? A concerted legislative effort, whether you want to call it passing rules about how we can't take down Confederate monuments, even though those Confederate monuments were built in the 1930s, 50 years after the Civil War was over. Or we can't talk about systemic racism we can't just talk about American history without being accused of doing something called critical race theory, which nobody really does anyway. It's just history. It's just teaching American history in a real way. We can't even do that. So yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree. Like we need to talk about Ukraine and we need to sympathize with Ukraine and we need to support Ukraine insofar as we are able, without creating, escalating to a third world war. But we also need to acknowledge that we need to give space to continued attention and space to the stuff that's happening here.
Well, and I think too, and I would argue that I think people probably are working on investigative reports regarding the pandemic or other ones. And a lot of times that type of journalism is not the sexy kind you see immediately on TV because it takes a lot longer. It takes a lot more research. It takes people sitting with piles and piles of paperwork for hours. So sometimes that does not come up till later and you don't realize that it's been in the works for a while. So sure. I'll add that in there as well. And then I think, lastly, I think people will hear what you said about, well, cooler heads will prevail. And I think a lot of people will say, what? You think that there will be a cool head in Vladimir Putin? You think there will be cool heads in his version of what we call a cabinet? So I just want you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, so, you see this throughout history, whether we're talking about Nasser in the Suez Crisis, or we're talking about, various moments in Russian history, during the Cold War. Even people continuously spoke of Khrushchev, for instance, as being a madman in the 1950s. But if you actually, historians who've gone back and done this work, and believe me, I'm a historian, right? This is all that historians do, is collect vast amounts of documents and spend forever writing books about them, right? That's what we do for a living. Often what you find is that these are rational actors making careful, rational decisions. Now, it's possible that Putin is crazy enough to escalate to continue to play this game and to escalate towards nuclear confrontation, but I don't think that that's going to happen. What we see, if we look back through Putin's tenure over the last 20 years, is that by and large, he is in fact a rational actor. He might not be making decisions that any of us agree with on a moral level. You can be a rational actor and not be a morally right actor, right? Putin is not doing anything that's acceptable in the larger sort of sense of international politics. There's no question, right? In the modern universe, the choices he's making are super, super problematic, but there is a rational, there is a rational understanding, a rational decision-making process, sadly, behind the stuff that he's doing. In the end, I think our outcome very likely is going to be that there's not going to be any escalation beyond the borders of Ukraine, both because Putin isn't going to push beyond Ukraine, and also because NATO is not going to push into Ukraine. So there is going to be the Ukrainians are fighting really hard and admirably, and one can only sympathize profoundly with what they're going through. And it's breathtaking what they're doing and how hard they're fighting. But in the end, they will be overwhelmed by an overwhelming Russian force. And the odds are very high that what we're going to see is a regime change. There's just going to be a regime change. Hopefully Zelensky gets out of it, right, and is able to survive in some way. But the odds are that we're looking at a regime change in Ukraine that will be Russian friendly, Russian puppet regime put in place, and a demilitarization of Ukraine. Now, the positive side of this story, if there is one, is to remember that for the last 1,000 years, Ukraine has been occupied by various other colonial powers, right? Whether it's Poland, Lithuania, or it's the Germans, or it's the Russians. Ukraine is constantly being invaded and occupied, throughout its history. And Ukraine knows how to do resistance. They know how to do resistance. So they know how to do it active resistance, and they know how to do passive resistance. They know how to undermine regimes, colonial regimes. They've been doing it for 1,000 years. And so it's true, right? It's very likely that there will be a regime change and that Russia will put in a puppet regime in Ukraine, but they will have a hard time holding on to it, because Ukraine will have all of the tactics that it's been practicing, for 1,000 years, to undermine that power. And eventually, right, Russia will have to face, again, like it has so many times in the past, it will have to face this crisis, right? This crisis of sovereignty in Ukraine. That's going to persist, whether they take over and win this time through or not.
A lot to take in here. Interesting takes here. Again, author and University of Alabama professor Margaret Peacock. I know that, like I said, there's a lot to break down here. We're going to continue watching this coverage for, I guess, as long as it takes. We're going to keep tuning in and seeing what happens to our friends and family in Ukraine. So again, thank you so much, Professor Peacock. Everybody watching, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much for having me.